The evening lights shimmered softly through the tall glass windows of the city's grand concert hall. It was one of those nights when people dressed in their best clothes, spoke in polite tones, and pretended the world outside didn't exist. Inside, laughter mixed with the soft notes of background music, and the air carried the smell of perfume and expensive wine. Waiters moved quickly from table to table, their trays balancing glasses and delicate plates of appetizers. Everyone there seemed important: artists, business owners, sponsors, and journalists. It was a night made for the elegant and confident. Near the corner of the room, a woman stood quietly, unnoticed by most. Her dress was simple, neat, but plain. She wasn't one of the guests. She worked at the venue part-time, helping with small tasks, checking the seating arrangements, carrying sheet music, and making sure the performers had what they needed. She moved quietly, almost blending into the background, but there was something calm and kind about her. She didn't speak much, yet her eyes carried warmth and a certain sadness, as if she carried memories she didn't often share. While the guests laughed and greeted one another, she carefully placed music folders on a table near the piano. The piano stood under a soft spotlight at the front of the hall, a beautiful black grand, polished so well that it reflected the lights above. Most people glanced at it with admiration, but for her it was more than just an instrument. Every time she passed by, her eyes lingered on the keys. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if remembering how it felt to play. But she turned away quickly, knowing her place. This was not her world anymore. She once dreamed of playing in halls like this. Years ago, before her life changed, she had spent hours every day at an old upright piano in a small apartment. Music had been her escape, her joy, her way of speaking when words didn't come easily. But dreams don't always survive life's weight. Family struggles, financial pressure, and illness had forced her to stop pursuing music. The piano she once loved had been sold to pay bills. Since then, she worked quietly, moving from job to job, never complaining, just surviving. The gala that evening was supposed to feature a famous pianist from abroad. Posters with his name had been placed near the entrance, and people had come expecting to be impressed. The organizers were proud of the lineup, sure that the performance would make the night unforgettable. The woman helped set up the stage earlier, arranging the bench, checking the lights, and placing the sheet music that had been specially printed for him. She felt a small ache in her chest as she looked at the sheets, recognizing every note of the piece. She knew it by heart. It was one of the first songs she had ever played as a child. But she brushed the thought away, reminding herself that she was just there to help. As the evening went on, the event moved smoothly. People gave speeches, a small orchestra played, and applause filled the room. The atmosphere was light, proud, and elegant. No one noticed the tension building near the back of the hall, until one of the organizers walked quickly toward the stage, whispering something to another staff member. Within minutes, whispers spread among the guests. Something was wrong. The star pianist, the main performer of the night, had called to say he wouldn't be coming. His flight was delayed due to a sudden storm in another city. The news fell like a heavy silence. The organizers looked pale, realizing what it meant. The evening's highlight, the one moment everyone had come for, was gone. Without that performance, the gala would lose its magic. Guests had paid high prices for their seats, and sponsors expected a show. The woman stood nearby, watching the growing panic. One of the organizers rubbed his forehead, muttering, "We can't just end it here. We need someone to play something, anything." Another suggested bringing up one of the local musicians, but none were available on such short notice. The piano sat in the middle of the stage, waiting, silent and almost sad under the lights. That's when a few guests, half amused and half curious, turned their attention toward the quiet woman. She had been seen earlier dusting the piano and adjusting the seat. One of them, a well-dressed man with a drink in his hand, said jokingly, "Maybe she can play for us. She seems to know her way around that piano." His friends laughed. The woman froze, unsure if she should respond. Another voice joined in, "Yes, why not? Let's see if our helper here can entertain us." The laughter grew, not cruel but careless, the kind that stings because it assumes you're too small to be offended. The organizer tried to wave them off, embarrassed, but the idea had already taken hold among a few of the guests. The man continued teasing, "Come on, don't be shy. It's just a few notes. We won't judge too harshly." His friends chuckled again, sipping their wine. The woman forced a small, polite smile, not knowing what to say. Inside, her heart raced. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Her hands worked every day, cleaning, carrying, organizing, but not playing. Still, part of her longed to feel the keys again, even for a moment. She looked at the piano and then at the laughing guests. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind. Memories of her mother's small hands guiding hers on the keyboard. The sound of rain outside their window while they practiced. The feeling of peace that music once gave her. Then she remembered how everything ended. The day she closed the piano lid for the last time, telling herself she would never play again. But now, standing there, something inside her stirred. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was something deeper. An old flame that refused to die completely. The laughter around her faded into a blur as she took a slow breath. The organizer whispered quietly, "You don't have to do this," but she shook her head gently. She wasn't doing it for them. The room watched as she walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet strangely freeing. The grand instrument seemed to shine brighter as she approached, as if it recognized her. The chatter softened. A few guests smiled in amusement, expecting a clumsy attempt. Others whispered to each other, wondering what this was about. The man who had started the joke leaned back in his chair, smirking, certain it would be entertaining in the wrong way. When she reached the piano, she paused. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its black surface. She pulled the bench out slowly, sat down and rested her hands on her lap for a moment. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of embarrassment, but from the weight of what this moment meant. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let her hands hover above the keys. For a brief second, the entire hall went silent. The soft clinking of glasses stopped. The rustle of dresses and suits faded. All that remained was her and the piano. No one knew her story. No one knew how much she had lost or how much she had loved music. To them, she was just a quiet worker who had stepped out of her place for a moment. But as she sat there, the memories of her mother's gentle voice and the warmth of the old piano filled her mind again. She whispered quietly to herself, almost like a promise, just one song, and with that, she pressed the first key. The first note she played was soft, almost fragile, like a whisper trying to be heard in a crowded room. For a moment, no one reacted. The guests still wore faint smiles, expecting a few awkward sounds before the piano fell silent again. But something about that very first tone was different. It carried warmth, as if her touch had life in it. Her fingers moved slowly at first, feeling their way across the keys. Years of silence made her uncertain, yet her body remembered. It was as though the music had been sleeping inside her, waiting patiently for this exact moment to wake again. The next few notes followed, gentle, pure, and steady. The hall, filled only minutes ago with laughter, began to quiet down. The woman didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were closed, her face calm. She wasn't trying to impress them. She wasn't even thinking about them. She was somewhere else entirely, back in that small room from her past where her mother's voice softly guided her hands. "Feel it, don't force it," she used to say. And now those words returned like a faint echo as she began to play more confidently. But the silence didn't last long. In one corner, someone chuckled under their breath. Another whispered, "Well, at least she's trying." The faint sound of glass tapping on a table cut through the melody. It wasn't cruel yet, but the disbelief was still there. They didn't understand what they were hearing. Not yet. She continued, ignoring the whispers. Her hands started to find rhythm, the notes weaving together like a slow tide rolling onto the shore. The song she had chosen wasn't complicated or showy. It was delicate and full of emotion, something that spoke straight to the heart. Her body swayed slightly as she played, her fingers flowing effortlessly now, the years of silence melting away. One of the guests leaned forward, curious. His expression changed from amusement to mild surprise. The notes were clean. The timing was perfect. She wasn't fumbling, she was playing with skill. Another person whispered, "She actually knows how to play." But before anyone could answer, she shifted into a deeper passage of the piece. The sound filled the hall, rich and powerful, like a wave sweeping over everyone at once. Her heart pounded. Every memory, every moment of pain and hope flowed through her fingertips. It wasn't just music, it was her story. The sound seemed to wrap around the room, softening faces, quieting voices. Even the man who had started the joke sat still now, his smirk fading slowly. But she didn't see them. Her eyes were still closed, lost in the music. The light from above glowed softly on her face. The piano responded to her touch with warmth and strength. It was as if it had been waiting for someone who truly understood it. Each note she played came from a place of honesty, not pride. Halfway through, her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but emotion. The memories were flooding in. Her mother's smile the day they sold their piano, the endless nights she worked just to keep going. All of it lived inside the melody, and somehow even the pain felt beautiful in that moment. The audience had grown completely silent now. Not a glass clinked. Not a whisper broke through. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Every eye in the room was fixed on the simple woman sitting at the piano. They could feel something that went beyond skill. Something real. She reached the softest part of the song, her touch barely brushing the keys. The notes hung in the air like fragile glass shimmering before fading. A few people took quiet breaths as if afraid that any sound might break the spell. Then came the shift. The song deepened. Her hands began to move faster, building emotion. The once delicate tune grew bold, passionate, alive. The sound filled every corner of the hall. The piano sang under her touch, powerful and free. The audience could feel her emotion rising through every note, her struggles, her loss, her strength. It was impossible not to feel it. In the back row, one older woman pressed her hand against her chest. She wasn't just listening, she was feeling every beat of the story behind the music. A man next to her who had been laughing earlier now sat quietly, his face thoughtful. The same people who had mocked were now caught in something they didn't expect. The woman at the piano didn't play for praise. She didn't play for attention. She played because it was the only language she truly knew. Every movement of her hands carried a piece of her heart. The music spoke of years of silence, of forgotten dreams, of small hopes that refused to die. And somehow it reached everyone in the room. As she continued, she started to lose track of time. The lights above seemed softer. The piano beneath her hands felt lighter. She could almost hear her mother whispering again, telling her she was proud. She smiled faintly as she played, not because of the audience, but because, for the first time in years, she felt whole again. When the final notes began, the hall was so still that even the sound of her breath seemed loud. She slowed her hands, letting the melody fade into a tender whisper, until only silence remained. Her fingers rested on the keys, trembling slightly. She didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. The room was frozen. Every face was turned toward her, silent, motionless. Some eyes glistened. Others stared in disbelief. The man who had started the teasing looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He seemed small now, sitting in his expensive suit, realizing what he had done. The first sound that broke the silence was a single clap from the far side of the hall. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the hall was filled with applause that rolled like thunder. People stood from their chairs, clapping with all their hearts. Some even whistled, others cheered, and a few had tears in their eyes. She blinked, unsure of what was happening. She hadn't played for recognition. But as she looked around, she saw faces full of something genuine. Respect. The same people who laughed at her now stood in awe. The organizer approached her with wide eyes, whispering, "That was incredible." He didn't even have words. The applause went on for nearly a minute before it began to fade. The woman gave a small nod and stood slowly, her hands still shaking from the emotion of it all. Someone from the crowd called out, "Who are you?" She smiled faintly. "Just someone who used to love the piano," she said softly. Her voice was calm, almost humble. She didn't stay long after that. She quietly stepped off the stage, bowing her head slightly as she passed through the crowd. Some people tried to stop her, to ask her name or thank her, but she just smiled and kept walking. Behind her, people began to talk excitedly. "Did you see that? Who is she?" That was better than the professional. The energy in the room had completely changed. The same hall that once echoed with laughter now buzzed with admiration and wonder. She walked toward the back of the hall, her heart still pounding. For the first time in years, she felt light. The heaviness she had carried for so long seemed to lift with each step. She went to the quiet hallway behind the stage and leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of sadness, but relief. She had played again. She had faced their laughter and turned it into silence, then into respect. She whispered quietly, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure who she was thanking, maybe her mother, maybe the music itself. Outside the hall, the city lights glowed softly. She stepped out into the cool night air, breathing deeply. The world looked different now, brighter, somehow more forgiving. She had reminded herself of who she was, and in doing so, reminded everyone else that worth isn't measured by clothes or titles or status. Back inside, people were still talking about her performance. Some had recorded parts of it on their phones, replaying it in disbelief. They couldn't stop watching the moment when the simple woman had turned their laughter into silence. But she didn't know that. She was already walking down the quiet street, her shoes clicking softly on the pavement. For the first time in years, she felt proud. Not of the applause, but of the courage it took to sit down and play. The night air was cold, but her heart was warm. She didn't look back at the concert hall. She didn't need to. The music she played would stay there long after she left, echoing in the minds of those who had heard it. It was a moment none of them would forget, a reminder that true beauty often hides in the quietest souls. And as she walked away, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe. It's time to start again." The wind carried her words away, but the feeling stayed. That night, something inside her changed. She was no longer just the quiet helper in the corner. She had found her voice again, through the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her, the piano. The morning after the gala, the city woke up as it always did. Cars moved through the streets, people hurried to work, and shops opened one by one. But inside that same concert hall, something had changed. The staff still spoke about what had happened the night before, their voices full of surprise and wonder. They couldn't stop talking about the quiet woman who had stepped up to the piano and played like a professional, maybe even better. "Did you see her face?" one of them said. "She looked so calm, but the way she played, it was like magic." "I've never seen the hall go that quiet," another replied. "Not even when the big stars perform." By midday, videos from the gala had already started to spread online. A few guests had recorded her performance on their phones. They didn't know they had captured something that would move thousands of hearts. One video showed her sitting at the piano, her hands steady and graceful, playing as if the world around her didn't exist. The caption read, "The woman they mocked. Listen to her play." Within hours, comments began to pour in. People wrote things like, "She plays with so much feeling, and this made me cry." Others asked who she was, where she came from, and why no one had ever heard of her before. The clip spread from one person to another, and soon it was everywhere. Social media pages, blogs, even local news feeds. But while her performance was becoming a small online sensation, she had no idea. She was busy with her usual day. She worked at a small cafe that morning, serving coffee and cleaning tables. The owner, who had heard about the gala, smiled at her kindly and said, "I heard you played last night." She looked surprised and said softly, "It was nothing, really." But the owner shook his head. "It wasn't nothing. People can't stop talking about it." She smiled politely and went back to work, thinking maybe it was just kind talk, something that would fade in a day or two. But it didn't fade. By that evening, reporters had started calling the event organizer, asking about the mysterious woman who stole the show. The organizer tried to explain that she was just a part-time helper, not a performer, and that what happened was completely unexpected. That only made the story more interesting. People loved stories like this, stories about ordinary people who turned out to be extraordinary. At home that night, she sat by her small window sipping tea. The world outside was quiet. She still didn't know the full reach of what she had done. Her old phone buzzed with a message from a coworker. It said, "You're all over the internet. People are calling you the mystery pianist." She blinked at the message, thinking it was a joke. But when she opened the link, her hands began to tremble. There she was, on screen, sitting at the grand piano under the soft lights. The comments below were endless. Some people were writing that her music made them feel peace after a long day. Others said her performance reminded them of their own mothers, or of lost dreams they had forgotten. She scrolled for a long time, speechless. She couldn't believe that her quiet moment, meant for no one but herself, had reached so many hearts. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to take it in. She didn't feel famous or proud, just overwhelmed. The same performance that came from pain and memory was now bringing comfort to others. It was as if the world had finally heard what she had been keeping inside for years. Over the next few days, things changed quickly. Journalists tried to find her. Music teachers and students began sharing her video saying, "This is what true emotion looks like." One local TV station even did a short segment about her, showing clips of the performance with soft background music. The headline read, "The Unknown Pianist Who Touched Thousands." The cafe where she worked became busier. Customers came in, some pretending not to stare, others asking shyly, "Are you the woman from the video?" She always answered modestly, "Yes, that was me," and smiled. Some people asked her to play again, but she would always say, "Maybe another time." Inside, though, her heart was full of both happiness and fear. Happiness because she had finally been heard, but fear because she wasn't sure what to do with it. She had spent so long living quietly that the sudden attention felt strange, almost unreal. One afternoon, while she was cleaning a table, a little girl came up to her holding a small notebook. "Miss," the girl said softly, "I saw you playing the piano on my mom's phone. It was really beautiful." The woman looked down at the child and smiled. "Thank you," she said. The girl asked, "Can you teach me someday?" That question hit her harder than anything else. She didn't know what to say at first. She hadn't thought of herself as someone who could teach or inspire. She had just played from her heart. But now, looking at that little face, she realized that maybe her music could mean something more than just one performance. She nodded gently and said, "Maybe I can." The girl smiled and ran back to her mother. That night, she took out a small notebook and started to write for the first time in years. She wrote about her mother, about the piano they once had, and about that night at the gala. She wrote how scared she was when everyone laughed and how everything changed once she played. The words came easily, like the music had before. It felt good to let them out. A week later, she received a letter. It came from a local music foundation. They had seen her video and wanted to invite her to play at a small charity concert for children. "We would be honored if you joined us," the letter said. She read it twice, unsure if it was real. For a moment, she thought about refusing. It had been hard enough to play once. What if she failed this time? What if the magic was gone? But deep down, she knew she couldn't hide from it anymore. The piano wasn't just part of her past. It was part of who she was. Maybe it was time to stop running from it. She took a deep breath and wrote back, saying she would come. The following days were a mix of nerves and excitement. She practiced whenever she could, using an old keyboard a friend lent her. It wasn't the same as a real piano, but it was enough to bring her hands back to life. She played softly in the evenings, the music filling her small apartment. Neighbors sometimes stopped outside her door just to listen. One even slipped a note under her door that said, "Your music makes my nights peaceful. Thank you." On the night of the charity concert, she arrived early. The venue was smaller than the gala, but warm and welcoming. Children filled the front rows, some of them in wheelchairs, others sitting cross-legged on the floor. Their faces were bright with curiosity. She looked around and smiled nervously. This time she wasn't there by accident. She had been invited. When she sat down at the piano, her hands trembled just like before. But this time there was no laughter, no teasing. Only soft silence full of trust. She began to play slowly, choosing a simple melody full of hope. The sound floated gently through the room, warm and kind. The children listened quietly, some closing their eyes. By the time she finished, a few of the kids clapped with wide smiles. One of them shouted, "That was beautiful!" And everyone laughed softly. She laughed too, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt like she belonged. Later that evening, one of the event organizers told her, "You have a gift and you share it in a way that touches people. Don't stop now." Those words stayed with her. As she walked home that night, she thought about everything that had happened. The laughter, the music, the silence, the applause, and now this new beginning. She realized that maybe the world wasn't so cold after all. Sometimes it just took one honest act, one moment of courage to remind people of what truly matters. She didn't have fancy clothes or a famous name, but she had something no one could fake: heart. And that was enough. As she reached her small apartment, she looked up at the stars. The night air was cool, and the city seemed quieter than usual. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is where I was meant to be all along." She unlocked her door, walked inside, and sat by the window again. The city lights flickered below, and in the distance she could almost hear music. This time it wasn't just a memory. It was a promise that her story wasn't over yet. The days after the charity concert felt different from anything she had experienced before. For years, her life had followed the same quiet rhythm: work, home, sleep, repeat. But now there was something new in her heart. Each morning when she woke up, she felt a soft warmth inside her chest, the kind that comes from knowing that you've done something meaningful. Her second performance hadn't gone unnoticed. Several people from the audience had recorded short clips and shared them online. They wrote about how her music felt real, how it seemed to come from a place of truth. Those videos reached even more people than the first one from the gala. Soon her name, or at least the name people were using for her, the simple pianist, began to appear in newspapers and online articles. At first, she didn't pay much attention. She still lived the same way, working part-time, doing small chores, walking to the cafe each morning. But people had started recognizing her. Some would stop her on the street just to say thank you. Others would leave small notes for her at the cafe counter. One said, "Your music helped me sleep after weeks of anxiety." Another wrote, "You made me pick up my violin again." Each message touched her deeply. She couldn't believe that the music she once played only for herself was now reaching strangers around the world. It made her both happy and nervous. She never wanted fame or attention. She just wanted to live quietly and share something honest. One afternoon, as she was leaving the cafe, she noticed a man waiting near the door. He was holding a camera bag and a notepad. He smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment?" She hesitated, unsure, but nodded. He introduced himself as a journalist from a local TV station. He told her that they had been trying to reach her for weeks and wanted to do a short interview about her story, how she started playing, why she stopped, and what it felt like to perform again. She thought about it carefully. For a long time, she had avoided attention, hiding behind quietness. But maybe it was time to tell her story, not for fame, but for the people who might need to hear it. So she agreed. A few days later, a small film crew came to her apartment. They were polite and respectful, setting up their cameras carefully. She felt nervous at first, her hands fidgeting in her lap. But once the questions began, she relaxed. She spoke softly, choosing her words with care. She told them about her childhood, the small home, the old piano that used to sit by the window, the way her mother used to hum while cooking. She spoke about how music had been her escape, her dream, her whole world. And then she spoke about how it all faded away when life became harder. Her mother's illness, the bills, the long hours of work, one by one they took the place of her music. Her voice trembled when she said, "I thought that part of me was gone forever. But when they asked me to play that night, even though it started as a joke, something inside me woke up again." The interviewer listened carefully, his eyes soft with understanding. He asked her what it felt like to play in front of all those people. She smiled a little and said, "It felt like coming home." When the interview aired a week later, it spread everywhere. People were moved not just by her talent, but by her honesty. Her story touched hearts because it wasn't about fame or luck. It was about hope, about finding something beautiful again after years of silence. Messages poured in from around the world. Some offered her opportunities to perform. Others simply thanked her for reminding them that it's never too late to start again. She read every message slowly with tears in her eyes. There were letters from elderly people who had given up painting or writing long ago and now wanted to begin again. There were young people who said her story made them believe in themselves. She realized then that what she had done was bigger than just music. It was about courage. One morning, she received a call from a music academy in the city. The director wanted to meet her. She felt nervous but agreed to go. When she arrived, she was surprised by the warmth of the place. Children running through the hallways, the sound of instruments from every room. The director, a gentle woman with kind eyes, greeted her at the door. They sat down in the small office surrounded by shelves of sheet music. The director said, "We watched your story and we were very moved. Our students could learn a lot from someone like you, not just about music, but about heart. Would you consider teaching here, even part-time?" Her heart almost stopped. Teach? She had never thought of herself as a teacher. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She had lived enough, felt enough, and learned enough from her mistakes to guide others. She didn't have fancy degrees, but she had something else. Real experience. She said quietly, "If I can help even one child believe in themselves, I would be happy to." And so, she began teaching. At first, she took only a few students, children who loved music but often doubted their own abilities. She sat with them for hours, showing them not just how to press the keys, but how to listen, to the notes, to their hearts, to the silence between sounds. She often told them, music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. If your heart is in it, people will feel it. Her students loved her. Parents noticed how their children changed, how they started to play with more confidence and joy. Slowly, her reputation grew. More people wanted to learn from her, not just because she was talented, but because she was kind and humble. One afternoon after her last class, she sat alone in the empty practice room. The piano stood quietly before her. She touched the keys lightly, playing a simple melody she had made up. The sun streamed in through the window, lighting up the dust in the air. She smiled to herself, thinking how far she had come from that night at the gala. Sometimes she still couldn't believe it. The woman who once cleaned the stage was now standing on it. The one they laughed at was now the one others looked up to. But she never let pride take over. She still lived simply, still worked part-time, still walked to the academy instead of taking a car. She didn't want to lose the part of her that had kept her grounded all these years. Months passed. The video of her interview continued to inspire people across the world. Musicians wrote songs about her story, and artists painted her image beside a grand piano. She received letters from distant countries, many of them saying the same thing. You reminded us that beauty can come from anywhere. One evening, while closing the academy, she found a small envelope left on the piano. It had no name, just a note inside that read, "Thank you for helping me believe I can play again. I'll never forget you." She smiled and folded it carefully, tucking it into her bag. It reminded her of why she continued, why every note mattered. That night as she walked home, the air was cool and gentle. The streets were quiet except for the sound of her footsteps. She thought about her journey, the fear, the humiliation, the courage, the applause, and the new beginnings. Every step had brought her to this moment. At home, she lit a small candle and sat by her window. The same spot where months ago she had watched her first video go viral. Now things were different. Her heart wasn't heavy anymore. She no longer looked back with regret. She had found peace through the same music she once thought she had lost forever. She whispered softly, "Thank you," to the stillness of the night. Maybe to her mother, maybe to the universe, or maybe to the piano itself. The flame flickered, casting a warm glow on her face. She smiled faintly, knowing that life doesn't always turn out the way we plan, but sometimes it turns out even better. That simple woman, once mocked and overlooked, had become a symbol of resilience, not because she wanted to, but because she chose to stand up when no one expected her to. She proved that even the quietest voice can reach the loudest hearts, if it's honest enough. And somewhere out there, in living rooms, classrooms, and small cafes, people were still watching her story, some for the first time, others for comfort. Every time her fingers touched those piano keys in that viral video, someone, somewhere, was reminded to try again. Months turned into a year, and her life slowly found a new rhythm. The quiet woman who once avoided the spotlight now spent her days surrounded by music and young hearts eager to learn. She had become something of a local legend, though she never acted like one. Her mornings began with simple tea, her afternoons were filled with lessons, and her evenings ended with soft melodies that drifted out of her window. The world, however, hadn't forgotten her. Every now and then she would see an article or a message from someone saying how her story inspired them. But she always smiled and brushed it off with gentle humility. To her, those moments weren't about fame. They were about people finding courage through her story. One evening, while she was finishing a lesson, the academy's director came into the room holding a letter. "You might want to read this," she said, placing it gently on the piano. The woman wiped her hands and unfolded it carefully. The letter was from the organizers of a major national music festival that took place every year in the capital city. They were inviting her to perform as a special guest. Her eyes widened. She had heard about that festival all her life. It was a stage where the country's best musicians gathered, a place she had only dreamed of visiting as a child. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked up and whispered, "Me? Why me?" The director smiled. "Because your music moved millions. Because you remind people that art comes from the heart, not from titles or wealth." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about the letter. The thought of performing again on such a grand stage both thrilled and frightened her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she couldn't meet their expectations? The doubts crept in quietly like shadows in the dark, but then she remembered the faces of her students, the way they smiled when they played, the trust in their eyes. How could she tell them to believe in themselves if she didn't do the same? So she decided to say yes. The weeks leading up to the performance were filled with preparation. She practiced for hours every day, losing herself in the keys. Her fingers were older now, not as fast as before, but they still carried warmth and honesty. She didn't aim to impress. She wanted to express. She wanted people to feel what she felt when she played, to feel that life, no matter how hard, still held beauty. The festival organizers offered her a selection of grand pieces to perform, but she declined. Instead, she chose to compose her own, a piece that told her story. It began with quiet, hesitant notes like a memory trying to find its way back. Then it rose gently, filled with emotion, before ending in a peaceful resolution as if the storm had finally passed. She called it the Silent Song. When the day of the performance finally arrived, the city buzzed with excitement. The theater was large and majestic, filled with hundreds of people dressed in elegant clothes. The audience included famous musicians, critics, and even students from her academy. Many had come just to see the woman whose humble story had captured the world. Backstage, she sat quietly, eyes closed, taking deep breaths. The muffled sound of the crowd reached her ears like the distant rush of waves. A young stage assistant approached and whispered, "You're next." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling just a little. When her name was announced, a hush fell over the audience. She stepped onto the stage wearing a simple dress, her hair tied back neatly. There were no fancy lights or grand entrances. Just her, the piano, and silence. For a few seconds she stood still, looking out at the sea of faces. Somewhere in the front row she saw the director of the academy smiling proudly. She also noticed a few familiar faces from her first humiliating gala years ago. This time their expressions were different, soft, almost regretful. She didn't hold anger anymore. She had outgrown it. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. Then slowly she began to play. The first notes were gentle, almost fragile. They floated through the air like falling petals. The hall was so quiet that one could hear the faint sound of her breath between phrases. As the music unfolded, it painted pictures without words, of struggle, of loneliness, of rediscovered hope. It carried the pain of being overlooked and the joy of being found again. Midway through the piece, her playing grew stronger, filled with emotion. The melody swelled like a wave, echoing through the hall, wrapping everyone in warmth. Some people closed their eyes, others held their breath. The sound seemed to come not just from the piano, but from something deep within her soul. And then, in the final moments, the music softened again, returning to where it began, gentle and still, as if whispering, "It's okay now." When she pressed the last key, the sound lingered in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. The hall remained utterly quiet. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly applause began, soft at first, then louder, growing into a thunderous standing ovation. Tears filled her eyes as she stood and bowed. It wasn't just applause she was hearing, it was forgiveness, respect, and love all mixed together. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, though she never chased it. After the performance, people came backstage to congratulate her. Famous musicians told her how deeply her music had touched them. Reporters wanted interviews. But she smiled kindly and said, "Thank you, but I think the music said everything I needed to say." Later that night, after everyone had gone, she returned to the empty stage. The theater was quiet, the lights dim. She sat at the piano once more and ran her fingers gently across the keys. She whispered softly, "We did it." For a moment, she imagined her mother sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. A tear rolled down her cheek, but it was a happy tear. The next morning, news outlets across the country talked about her performance. They called it the most heartfelt act of the festival, and clips of the silent song spread quickly online. Millions watched, just as they had before, but this time her story came full circle. People wrote things like, "Her music feels like healing," and "She doesn't just play the piano, she speaks through it." The world had many brilliant pianists, but what made her special was her heart. She wasn't the fastest or the most technical, She was real. Soon invitations came from around the world, from orchestras, universities, and concert halls. But she chose carefully. She didn't want to travel endlessly or live in hotels. She wanted to keep teaching, to stay close to the students who gave her purpose. So she accepted only a few performances each year, special ones where her music could mean something. Over time, she became known as the woman who played from the heart. Her story was featured in documentaries, books, and even films. But she never let fame change her. She still walked to the academy every morning, still greeted her students with a gentle smile, and still lived in the same small apartment filled with sunlight and music. Sometimes, after class, she would sit with her students and tell them stories, not about fame or success, but about faith and perseverance. She would say, "People may laugh at you. They may not understand your dreams. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that you never stop believing in the sound inside you." And the students listened carefully, because they knew she spoke from experience. Years later, when she grew older, her hands weren't as steady anymore, but she still played every day, even if just for a few minutes. Her students often visited, bringing flowers and stories of their own performances. Many of them had become musicians, teachers, and composers, all carrying a piece of her lessons in their hearts. One evening, as she played her favorite melody near the window, she looked outside at the glowing city. The lights flickered like tiny stars, and she felt a deep peace wash over her. She thought about that night long ago when people mocked her and forced her to play. If they hadn't, she might never have found herself again. Life, she realized, had a strange way of turning pain into purpose. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, just to life itself. And somewhere, far beyond the city, her music continued to echo through recordings, through memories, through every person she had ever inspired. The simple woman who once stood trembling before a crowd had become something eternal. Not a star, not a celebrity, but a reminder that greatness often begins quietly, with a single note played from the heart.